Hey everybody, how you doing? It's me again, Truth Teacher, coming at you with a new video. And we are continuing in our discussion, breaking down the propaganda and the talking points of the three-letter people. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing an issue that keeps being brought up by the three-letter people as proof as to why Puerto Ricans in particular were not part of the evolution of hip-hop and couldn't be. And that's because Puerto Ricans and Black Americans didn't socialize with each other because Puerto Ricans were racist. So, let's deal with that topic. And as always, I'm going to be 100% honest, even if it might be uncomfortable for some people. I'm going to tell the truth. I grew up in the Bronx I was born there in the late 60s in Soundview, and then I moved to Jamaica. Spent my childhood there, and I came back in 1976. I was living in the Bronx on the Grand Concourse until 1982 when I left. So I'm well acquainted with what the social dynamic was like in the Bronx at that time. So what did I see? What did I experience? Were Puerto Ricans racist against Black people? And the honest answer to that question is yes. There were Puerto Ricans who did not like Black people, whatever their ethnicity was. They didn't even like other Puerto Ricans who were darker complected. They had a problem with that. That's absolutely true. But it's also true that there were a lot of Puerto Ricans who were not racist. They didn't care what anybody's skin color was or what their facial features were or their hair type or any of that. They treated people with respect. As long as they were treated with respect, they treated them with respect. A lot of Puerto Rican people were married to Black Americans. They were married to West Indians, English-speaking West Indians. That was absolutely true. So, let's see. What about African Americans? Were there any racist African Americans back in the Bronx in the 70s? The answer to that question is yes. There were a lot of African American people who were racist. They didn't like Puerto Ricans. They did not like West Indians. They even had a problem with other African Americans if they weren't the right skin tone. Sometimes they had problems with people if they were too dark-skinned, or they had problems with people if they were too light-skinned for their liking. That absolutely was true. But at the same time, there were a lot of African Americans who didn't have a problem with anybody. They didn't care if you were Puerto Rican or if you were West Indian. They didn't care if you were dark-skinned or light-skinned. The only thing that mattered to them was if you treated them with respect. And if you treated them with respect, they would treat you with respect. A lot of African Americans were married to Puerto Ricans. A lot of African Americans were married to West Indians. And that's the truth. But what about West Indians? Were there racist West Indians? The answer to that question is yes. There were racist West Indians. Bigoted, opinionated, got shit to say about somebody all the time. They didn't like Black Americans. They didn't like Puerto Ricans. They didn't even like other West Indians if they weren't from the right island. That's true. But at the same time, there were a lot of West Indians who didn't care if you were Puerto Rican or African American, or if you came from another island that wasn't their island. As long as you treated them with respect, they treated you with respect. A lot of West Indians were married to people from other West Indian islands. A lot of West Indians were married to Puerto Ricans. A lot of West Indians were married to African Americans. So, what's the point here? The point is that there's a kernel of truth in these claims that the three-letter people are making, but it's not the whole truth. And more often than not, things are taken out of context. The fact of the matter is this, like I keep saying, human beings are human beings no matter where they are, no matter their skin tone or their religion. None of these things have a bearing on what kind of person a person is. The only thing that determines whether someone is good or bad is the content of their character. And that's on an individual basis. You can't look at an entire group of people and put them all in one box, because that's just not the way life works. That's not realistic. You know, yesterday I was visiting my aunt. God bless her. She's up in age. I think this year she's gonna hit either 87 or 88 years old. Unfortunately, she's confined to a nursing home. It's really sad. It's bittersweet. It's nice to visit her, but it's really sad to see the physical state that she's in, and knowing that it didn't have to be that bad, but things are a lot worse than they should be because she's in a nursing home. And these places are notoriously understaffed. Patients don't have enough workers to take care of them, and so they're not getting that kind of exercise they need, and because of that they deteriorate physically very rapidly. And that's the case with my auntie. But you know, being in that environment, she has a lot of time to think and, you know, reevaluate a lot of attitudes and ideas that she had when she was younger in life. You know, she says to me, I don't remember how we got on the topic, but she says to me, I know, when she came here to the United States, her, my mother, my uncle, they really didn't have a very easy time of it. They came here in the 50s, the mid-50s, and they faced a lot of discrimination, particularly from African Americans. They were met with, on many occasions, a lot of violence, a lot of verbal abuse, simply for the fact that they weren't African American. Now, did all African Americans treat them that way? No. But there were enough, let's just put it this way, there were enough negative interactions and extremely negative, physically violent, verbally violent, that it left a mark on them. And if you were African American, it's not that they didn't like you, but it's like they had to get to know you, because there was that trepidation, you know? There was that fear that something would be said or done, you know, that was unpleasant. So they were always guarded until they got to know a person. And, well, generally speaking, they didn't really take to African Americans because of the way they had been treated. If they got to know you and you were a decent person, you became like family to them. So, yeah, she had, you know, this way, she was very guarded. She felt most comfortable around other West Indians, or, you know, other Caribbean people, whether they were from, you know, the Spanish-speaking islands or not. She felt more comfortable with people who were closer to her culturally. So, you know, she's laying there in the bed because, you know, it was Easter. There was only 3 aides working on the floor. 3 aides for 45 people. Can you imagine that? And, you know, we're talking and she says to me, you know, she's looking at the news and she's seeing all the turmoil that's happening. And, you know, she's very much aware of what's going on, you know. They're trying to tell me that this woman has dementia. Okay, whatever. But, you know, she's making an analysis about all of this hysteria that's going on. And she says, you know something? Just because you have a negative interaction with somebody and they come from a particular group, it doesn't mean that everybody in that group is the same, that they're the same way. You can't, just because you have an interaction or a few interactions with people from a particular group that are unpleasant, you can't take that now and then put that on everybody from that group. That's not fair. It's not fair to judge a whole group of people based on the negative behavior of certain people in that group. And that's the whole point. You know, like when she said that, it, you know, it clicked. It's like, that's the whole thing that I've been trying to get across to people with all of these discussions about hip-hop and who was there and who was a co-creator and, you know, all of this stuff. The Bronx was not a paradise by any stretch of the imagination. Especially in that time in the 70s. It was rough. It was a very difficult place to grow up. And I experienced a lot of negativity. I experienced a lot of harassment. I experienced people being the absolute worst versions of themselves that they could possibly be. I experienced all of that. But that didn't mean that I also didn't have friends. That doesn't mean that I didn't have meaningful friendships and relationships. So, this argument that Puerto Ricans couldn't have had anything to do with the development of hip hop because there were racist Puerto Ricans, and they always use, God, I forgot the DJ. I'm really bad with people's names, especially celebrities. Forgot. What was, I think, Chase? He said that like he would get flack from Puerto Ricans. Oh, why are you listening to the Hocolo music? Well, yeah, stuff like that did happen. But it's important to put it in context. Just because you had Puerto Ricans who had that kind of mentality doesn't mean that all Puerto Ricans had that mentality. You know what I'm saying? For one thing, the Puerto Ricans who were down with hip hop and who were helping to create hip hop, obviously they weren't on that tip. They didn't have that racist mentality. So they hung around everybody. We all hung around together. Here's the thing, we all had our individual cultures, right? African Americans have their culture. And I'm talking about real culture. I'm not talking about street culture. I'm talking about real culture. And African Americans have several regional cultures, right? Depending on what part of the country you come from. They had their culture in the home. They had their traditions. They had things that they did. They had, their foods that they ate. And quite often, summertime, a lot of them would go on vacation down south to visit their grandparents or other family members. So they had their distinct culture that was very different than my culture, right? Same thing with Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans had their own music. They had their salsa, they had their bomba plena, they had their own foods. They had their own stuff going on in the home. In the summertime, a lot of them would go away to Puerto Rico to spend time with their grandparents or their family. Same thing with West Indians. Well, me, for instance, I grew up in Jamaica, Inside our home, we had our own distinct culture. We had our own distinct foods that were not the same foods that African Americans ate. I didn't even know what soul food was. Chitlins and collard greens and black eyed peas. I didn't know what any of that was. We don't eat black eyed peas in Jamaica. Or collard greens or any of that stuff. Ham hocks, that's not a part of our culture. So I had no idea. They had no idea, what our foods were. They'd come over to the house. What's that smell? Oh, that's curry. Why you smell like that? Why your house smell like that? They didn't know what curry was. Jamaican beef patties, yeah, they all knew what that was, but curry goat, curry chicken, they didn't know what any of that was. They had their own culture, and we had our own culture. But hip-hop was something that we all shared together. And mind you, this is back in the day when it didn't even have a name. There was no such name as hip-hop. That didn't exist. All we knew is that we were all hanging out in the street together. We had friends, and our friends were from different backgrounds. Some of us were West Indians, and some of us were Puerto Rican. And some of us were, as we call it back then, black. You know, because at that time we weren't using the term African American. And the different creative expressions of this thing that would be called hip-hop gave us an opportunity to have a common ground that we could all come together on, right? And it was all based on how good you were at whatever element it was that you were participating in. Could you dance? Were you good at dancing? Did you have artistic talent? Spray painting and doing graffiti and, throw-ups. Very few people were DJs, okay? Very few people were MCs, but, we'd all get together in the lunchroom and we'd make up our rhymes. We'd bang on the tables, making rhythms. And then we'd spit rhymes, Were you good at it? That was the only thing that mattered. So, once again, there's negative people in every community. They always have been, they always will be. But that's not an excuse to throw everybody under the bus and make believe that everybody was on that, that tip of negativity, because just as many people as there were who were negative, hateful, racist, whatever you want to call it, there were just as many people, maybe even more, who were not on that time. And so, yes, we all rocked with each other, People who were racist, obviously, if you were on that mentality, we didn't socialize with you, So, the Puerto Ricans who were involved in hip-hop, they weren't on that racist time. And the same thing goes with the African Americans and the West Indians. It's like we just treated people like people. And if you treated us with respect, we treated you with respect in return. That's the way our life was. And, there were times when we'd say slick shit to each other. We would tease each other about, our backgrounds or whatever. But it wasn't that serious. It's like shit that you say because, you just like snapping on each other, whatever. So Puerto Ricans were goya beans, and West Indians were coconuts, and African Americans, I don't know, what did we say about African Americans? I can't remember. But we had jokes for them too, We fought. We had friendships. I mean, it was just a whole gamut of human experience. So, once again, man, the real importance of this hip-hop thing is what it allowed us to be able to do. It gave us a voice. It gave us an escape from very unpleasant circumstances around us. It gave us an outlet to put our energies, to putting our energies into something that was constructive and creative, even though sometimes people looked at what we were doing as vandalism. But hey, better to be doing that than, robbing and killing people, right? But at the end of the day, man, we all were facing the same pressures together. It didn't matter if you were black or Puerto Rican or West Indian. We were all in the neighborhoods. We were all facing the same pressures. And we came together and we put our energies and our creativity into things that eventually would influence the entire world. And that's what's really important. Not all of this bullshit about who did what and who's better than what. None of us are any better than anyone else. We're all the same. We're just human beings trying to figure out this thing called life. That's all it is. So, until the next time, I'll see you guys again. Stay good. Stay happy. Stay healthy. And peace out.